Hello, I'm Nadira Hira, and I'm so pleased to be joined today by Achim Steiner as he wraps up his tenure as Administrator of the United Nations Development Program. After 8 incredibly consequential years at UNDP, we just couldn't let Achim leave these offices without one final conversation about his learnings and legacy. We're so grateful to have Achim here with us to reflect on all that's happened at UNDP, the lessons, the innovation, the impact, and everything that still lies ahead. Welcome, Achim.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for being with us. We have a lot of serious ground to cover, and we will do that. But first things first, this has been quite a journey. How do you feel?
I think in some ways very relieved that it is in some ways coming to an end, not because I want to depart, but the pressure and I think also the times in which I have been here in New York, also leading UNDP through COVID, through many of the crises that we have faced. It's a very intense job, and in that sense, pleased to see an institution ready for the next person to take the reins and hopefully to see it continue to thrive.
And it's been quite an arc for you, hasn't it?
Well, you know, sometimes when I stand by the window of my office, I look across to the UN headquarters and the East River, and it does sometimes strike me what an amazing journey life sometimes gives you. I was born on a farm in Brazil. My parents were farmers, and never in my life and literally into the 20s would I have ever dreamt that I would be working for the United Nations. And then I have had this privilege of being able to lead the United Nations Environment Program now for the last 8 years, the UN's largest development agency. And I think from that point of view, just a sense of sometimes surprise, but also gratitude. It's been an extraordinary opportunity to do what I love to do.
It's interesting, though, because you mentioned the times that we're in, and it is perhaps a dramatic understatement to say this feels like an unprecedented moment. So many of the things we've come to rely on, our institutions, our governments, even development itself, seem like they're under serious threat. So I wonder, is UNDP ready to face the future that's taking shape now?
Well, I think an institution should never say it's ready, because it can easily sound complacent or even become complacent. But I think what I have tried to do with my team and my colleagues and with the support of many in the United Nations family was to pivot UNDP into an institution that is focused on the future of development. I think in today's world, when I look at leaders in countries, when I look at leaders in civil society, they're thinking about the future. They're looking for partners to be able to understand what do we need to envisage as possibilities, how do we work backwards into decisions that need to be taken today. We live also in a much more interconnected world, so anticipating what might happen in one part of the world is fundamental to your ability to define your own decisions, your own pathway. And yet what we see in the world around us is in some ways exactly the opposite. And it is in that tension, I think, that any institution now has to calibrate itself and has to be very clear about what its purpose is, but also how it will go about fulfilling that expectation.
Speaking of that recalibration, which it sounds like has been part of the process in the entire time, let's go back to the beginning. When you started in 2017, how did you see the mission in front of you at UNDP?
Well, it was a time when the UN went through a major reform process. The UN development system was being reconfigured. It was not an easy time for UNDP to adjust itself to some of those changes. So my first task was really to persuade 23,000 colleagues that, yes, change sometimes comes unexpectedly, but let's focus on the future. What is the function? What is the role of UNDP? And frankly, as I said earlier on, countries were looking also for an institution that can walk with them, help them, and be a part of thinking about the future in order to inform today's decisions that need to be made. Development is an expression of the freedom to choose, whether as a country or as individuals. And trying to bring into UNDP that sense of being focused on the future, being part of walking that journey together with countries, became very much part of my focus initially. And the Future Smart, the Future Ready UNDP made everybody realize, okay, let's focus on what lies in front of us, and that way we can also rethink the future of development. And I think that has been very much part of this mission that emerged out of both the feedback we received, but also the necessity to take an institution that has 6 decades of history to not rest on its laurels, but rather to reinvent itself almost every day in terms of what its clients, its partners need.
That is no small order, and the universe didn't really make it easy on you over these 8 years. Can you talk about the biggest challenges you faced and how you met them as an institution?
COVID-19 remains, I think, to most of us to this day, perhaps the greatest challenge in the short term, because literally within a few days we had to pivot from a globally distributed organization to functioning literally, virtually, digitally, and keeping the operation going. One of my most humbling moments was at that point to see our colleagues around the world not batting one eyelid and saying, we're going to stay. And throughout the COVID-19 period, not one single office of UNDP shut down its operations. And that is also what makes the United Nations such an appreciated partner sometimes, because when the going gets tough, sometimes many kind of take a step back and say, we'll be back with you when things are calmer. We didn't, we don't, we stay and deliver. And I think COVID in that sense was the most extreme test operationally, but also became a moment in which I think UNDP, alongside our sister agencies and many NGOs around the world and the governments we serve with, discovered that they were capable of doing things they had never thought possible. And yet, you know, if we go on, COVID ended. What followed then was this strange period of economic recovery. Some countries beginning to take off again because they had the money to pay for the stimulus packages. A whole group of countries was stuck, and some of them are still stuck today. Development has not resumed, and that is disconcerting. So the next step was, how do you then talk about development international cooperation when in fact countries were increasingly turning inwards, and it's gotten worse.
That's stark and it's staggering. Looking forward, what's your advice about how to approach that for those in your position right now?
Countries may not always share the same views, they may have differences, but one thing that is incontestable in this century, we are bound to work together to solve the great threats to the future of humankind, of also national security for that matter. And I think in this current moment of turmoil and disruption, the tendency to turn inwards, uncertainty, fear, insecurity, fuel a kind of political narrative that actually blinds us to that necessity to work together. We are capable, and we need to realize that we actually live in an age of possibility. And this narrative that everything is kind of dystopian is also sometimes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the United Nations has to be that place, amongst others, that allows people to look through this fog right now and see that there is actually a pathway to the future.
I guess I would love to hear you reflect on the wins that you've had over these 8 years. What are the places where there were big leaps forward? And you've mentioned a few or touched on them, but to talk about the major impact that UNDP has had, what have those wins been?
We work in thousands of projects, in thousands of partnerships, and as I have traveled the world, I've learned to celebrate the small victories. When you add them up, you then begin to realize actually this is critical mass. And I'll pick a couple of examples. Take technology. UNDP was 10 years ago still really an analog development organization, and I think we all began to feel this extraordinary potential that digital and also access to internet and broadband would bring to communities all over the world. It was in its initial phase the privilege of the few, the richer, the wealthier, but people often forget 1995, only 15 million people had access to the internet. Fast forward to 2025 and the number exceeds 6.5 billion people. More people than were alive on planet Earth in 1995. That's development breakthroughs, and these don't just happen. They happen from technologies being, yes, made available, but also cooperation. UNDP then pivoted forward into having a digital development competence that we built up, learning from many countries around the world, focusing on digital public infrastructure. Another example is climate change. UNDP has for many years been a key partner in implementing climate support projects funded by the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund. But perhaps it took us a little bit longer than it should have to realize that we have this extraordinary network of literally projects in over 130 countries. When Glasgow, the COP in Glasgow came, the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Convention, countries had to produce their nationally determined contributions. We're about to go to Brazil later this year for the next COP, and again, it's a moment when countries have to step forward. Today, UNDP, with the whole UN development system, is committed to helping countries prepare these strategies. What we do sometimes happens in many different places. When you add it all up, you suddenly realize this is a world being supported and enabled to work together, to achieve together.
I was lucky enough to do my first event with you, which was the launch of the Accelerator Labs, and that felt like a huge win then, but I think that's probably even more true now. So I have to ask you to talk about that win. What are the Accelerator Labs and what's been their arc, so to speak?
You know, the idea that innovation is important, I think nobody needs convincing. That innovation is not an end in itself is also a lesson I think we have learned. So we took this idea of how do we inject into UNDP a capacity to learn from what's happening within a country, from the ecosystem around us, and see ourselves as an enabler. And my decision at that time was to say, no, we're not going to have one accelerator lab, as we call it, to accelerate the capacity to implement the SDGs. We're going to start with 60 and we're going to go to 90 in 18 months. And this has been an extraordinary story of 6,000 solutions that we discovered. And we use them either to influence public policy or to direct people towards them. And 2/3 of them have actually succeeded in growing beyond that discovery stage. So it's also an extraordinary record of success that I think has influenced the whole of UNDP thinking and many governments also.
And all that said, what do you say to the folks out there who feel that development might not be relevant at all anymore?
Look, I understand, because if you listen to the evening news right now, you would be forgiven to saying, you know, everything is going to hell in a handbasket in a way. And sadly, in many places around the world, we see development retrogressing, even in a more brutal way, conflicts and wars, destroying lives, infrastructure, even taking people's hope away. I always say development is ultimately about hope, and the ability to, you know, even in some of the darkest moments, be there to help people look forward with some sense of possibility, I think is extremely critical. I can tell you right now that the last 50 or 100 years have been nothing but an extraordinary success story. Life expectancy, the number of girls that have gone and had education, the ability also of technologies to reach, as I said earlier on, with digital technology, billions of people. We have seen some remarkable things happening. Development is the success story of the 20th century, and now the question is, can we continue that in the 21st century? But I do understand, as I say, when people sort of watch what's happening in the world, that they lose confidence. And I go back to this fear, this sense of uncertainty about the future. And I think what we are all called upon right now is to not sit back and become skeptics or cynics in a sense. This is a moment where we need to lean forward.
Speaking of, where does an oil tanker fit into this development story?
Well, you know, every day in these 8 years, I can tell you I walk into the office in the morning or I travel somewhere, and nothing is ever quite as you maybe have planned it. And one of the things that became part of our focus was an extraordinary environmental tragedy and disaster waiting to happen in the Red Sea. Off the coast of Yemen was an old oil tanker that, in the middle of this civil war and conflict, was essentially rusting away, but with over 1 million barrels of oil on it. For years, many different initiatives were underway to try and figure out a way in which one could essentially defuse this time bomb, because it really would have been the most extraordinary catastrophe in environmental terms. In the end, the United Nations brokered an agreement, and UNDP became the operational partner to help put together the most extraordinary consortium, and undertook the biggest, for UNDP, risky operation perhaps in its history, namely to transfer from one ship to another tanker, which, by the way, we had to buy at the time, and something I had not quite anticipated in my terms of reference, that buying an oil tanker would one day be perhaps part of my story. But with this extraordinary team, not only in UNDP, but in different entities of the UN system, our sister agencies also coming together, we succeeded. We moved over 1 million barrels of oil from a rusty tanker onto a replacement tanker, and essentially prevented, which I think over time would have been inevitable, a catastrophe from happening.
That's a brilliant story. Obviously, the job description for the next administrator needs an additional bullet.
Hopefully not another oil tanker, yeah.
But it makes me wonder, looking at your time here, this is hard work, and it's difficult to be motivated in it, even if it is very important to you. So what are the key experiences or moments or even people that have given you hope or kept you going, so to speak?
You know, one of the great privileges of working in the United Nations, and particularly in UNDP, because, you know, we have colleagues all over the world, is that when I travel and with them and through them, I meet the most extraordinary people. We often think that the world doesn't have enough people who are committed to change. I actually would argue the opposite. In some of the most desperate situations, you know, a refugee camp, an internally displaced people's camp, or people after, you know, these cataclysmic flood events where everything is destroyed, you discover this extraordinary capacity of human beings to be not only focused on what needs to be done in the next 6 or 12 hours, but also to rebuild and reconstruct. But let me also pay tribute to my colleagues, my staff. UNDP is not only UNDP, it also hosts the United Nations volunteers. 14,000 of them all over the world working as volunteers under the umbrella of the United Nations. And what an extraordinary gift to their societies, to our institutions. We have an office on South-South cooperation. We have a UN Capital Development Fund, even a small kind of IFI type institution. All of these are the platforms, together with our multi-partner trust fund, on which UNDP is, if you want, a collection of people committed to the idea that the United Nations and the UN development system has a great deal to give to the world, also into the future.
So fighting forward and not making it easy on yourself. we love that. Any final thoughts or a final call to action, perhaps?
No, Nadira, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I you know, enjoyed going through some of these different moments. I think above all, you know, a story like mine is not a story of legacy as an individual. It is more how we seize those moments and opportunities that life sometimes presents to us. I think we are never architects alone of our, you know, journey, but I have been deeply grateful to have been in a position of genuinely being empowered to make a difference, always with others. And sometimes that leads you to the top of an organization, sometimes it is in the midst of your community. And I simply want to celebrate that capacity to lead wherever you are. And hopefully people will also continue to view the United Nations as one of their natural allies, sometimes distant perhaps to where you are, but never irrelevant.
And never really actually that far.
True indeed.
Well, Achim, it has been a fantastic conversation. We look forward to seeing what's ahead for you, and truly, we are all so grateful for your leadership over these past 8 years. Thank you so much, and all the best.